Okay, so these are the notes on asexual reproduction. Same teak. So we've gone over sexual reproduction. Now we're comparing it to asexual reproduction. And the picture I've got there is a one-celled organism called an amoeba. You might have heard of those before. They're actually eukaryotic, not prokaryotes, and they can reproduce both asexually and sexually. But this is showing asexual reproduction, where they split into two, and that process is called binary fission. And you will learn a little bit about that today on these notes. But notice that it says it's pointing to the nucleus, right? Because that's splitting, and they always tend to say it's two daughter cells when they're doing this on asexual reproduction. And I guess that's just kind of the way of showing you that they're an exact copy of the original. Um, so that's usually how they show it. Um, so asexual reproduction, let's go over some characteristics, advantages, disadvantages, just like we did with sexual reproduction. So always involves one parent, right? And results in an exact duplicate of that parent. So I like this little GIF because it showed the starfish, which can regenerate a couple of different ways, getting split, or just one arm can become a whole new individual. It just depends. So they have that ability, but it's an exact copy. Of course, they also reproduce sexually, laying eggs, that kind of thing. Some advantages. Usually it's faster and easier, so a new plant or animal can colonize an area more quickly, and you can see that with the grass. It's got what are called runners, and they just spread. That's asexual reproduction. Of course, grass can produce seeds too sexually, so they produce both ways, but that's just one example of asexual reproduction there. Another advantage is no mate, no travel, saves energy, right? And the picture I've got there for you is a hydra, which is a fairly simple multicellular organism, and they reproduce asexually by budding, and you just see that little growth on the individual, and it starts to grow out, and basically it just drops off and becomes an independent organism, but it's an exact copy of the parent. They also reproduce sexually, so this is one that reproduces both ways, but they have that ability to reproduce asexually through budding. You'll learn a little bit more about that. Okay, another one is it's less complex, more reliable, right? It's a much quicker, easier process, happens fairly reliably. Here you see another one-celled organism called a paramecium, and it's going through the stages of dividing. See, paramecium cell, and you have the division of the micronucleus, that's the nucleus dividing into two, then the macronucleus, separation of the cells, and you have the formation of the two new cells from the one. It can produce a large number of offspring very quickly, right? And you see this with these bacteria that are just dividing over a period of time. And this probably happened over, minutes, and you can get that many produced through asexual reproduction. Exponential growth, right? Disadvantages of asexual reproduction, there are some. New organisms are genetically identical to the parent and each other, so you have clones, and what does that lead to? A lack of adaptation. You can't adapt as readily if all the individuals in the population are exactly the same. It's going to be tougher for the population to adapt to any changes. With no variation, it's hard to adapt. They may be becoming extinct, and probably countless numbers of species of one-celled organisms and asexually reproducing organisms have gone extinct because of that, not able to adapt to a very quick change in an environment. However, there they do still have the ability to adapt a little bit. And if you see on the hand sanitizer bottles, it always says 99.9% of all germs killed. Well, there's that 0.1% that are surviving, and actually doctors and scientists are saying we're creating a super race of germs because we're using hand sanitizer. But anyway, some examples of asexual reproduction. We've got plants and fungi that make spores. Right? Spores are tiny little, they're not like a seed, they're actually a cell, and they get distributed usually by the wind and land somewhere, and if the conditions are right, you get growth. And some plants reproduce that way, some primitive plants like ferns, and all your fungus reproduce that way, and that's fungus spores are everywhere. And I think I talked briefly about that before, but you get bread mold growing inside the bread with the bag because they're everywhere. You can't stop that. You just need the right conditions. They're going to start to grow. And that's why after a rain, sometimes you start to see the toadstools and little mushrooms growing in the lawn because the spores are already there. Binary fission. I talked about it briefly earlier. Single-celled organisms like bacteria, amoeba, paramecium split in half, become two new individuals. Budding. Like I showed you with the hydra earlier, yeast is another one that uses budding. That's a pretty weird organism too. And you hear about yeast when it's for baking or making beer, those kinds of things, or maybe it's an infection, but they can spread really rapidly. They do not divide in half. They produce by budding. Runners, like I showed you with that one little GIF before, where grass and other plants spread by sending out these shoots horizontally across the soil. And wherever the little places on those shoots hit the soil, they can actually take root and become new parts of the plant. Most plants that do that also reproduce sexually with seeds. Strawberries are one of them. You know that fruit's got tons of seeds in it. But they can reproduce asexually by sending out those runners. Fragmentation. So some plants, you can break parts of them off and then just put them in the soil and they start to grow again. So that's a form of asexual reproduction. Worms, like your earthworms, can do that. Also, planaria. I mentioned this also. They'll start to grow a new head on their own and then split down the middle into two organisms. That's fragmentation. The difference between that and regeneration is, when they're wounded or you cut them, that's when they're going to regenerate the parts. That's the difference. And regeneration happens in planaria, but also starfish, sponges. They just start to grow new parts or whole new individuals during regeneration. All right, I put in a little bit about asexual reproduction from the book. Here's the read function right here. I highlighted it for you. A little more, how do organisms reproduce asexually? And there's 4 of those types of asexual reproduction, and 3 of them I went over. Well, actually all of them I went over, but a little more detail from the book. Again, you can have it read to you. And then you've got 2 slides to answer about this. So asexual reproduction and how do organisms reproduce asexually. So make sure you're making a copy of these. Make sure you're adding them to your notebook. We're filling up that notebook, and use those table of contents, guys. Go back and set that up, especially maybe over the Thanksgiving break. That'd be a good time when you have some time to do that. It's not that difficult, it just takes a little time, and that way you'll have that done. That'll be a good way to stay organized with the notebook.